Thanks. Maybe I could throw a question at Keith. Fairly gloomy outlook there, but I suppose it makes me think about the eastern seaboard of the United States, where they have. I mean, it's just every time you look at a map there's just maps of different waves of diseases coming through. And I'm just wondering, do you have any knowledge of what's happening there? Is that because of they're very complacent? Have they tried to deal with it, or have they just given up? Have they decided it's easier to ignore it? I mean, or are they just really saying to us, you can't control these things?
Yeah, I'm the honest answer, I don't know enough about the way they've approached diseases there. But one of the advantages they've got is a much wider palette of species, so that, okay, chestnut's knocked out, but you still have half a dozen or a dozen or so other broadleaf species will take over. Losing the hemlock, yeah, but they've got 2 or 3 conifers in there as well. So I think they've got the advantage of a much wider range of tree species, whereas over the whole of Britain, about 90% of the broadleaf tree cover, I think, is about 4 or 5 species.
Any more questions? We'll wait for the microphone if you can. Yeah.
Hello. Just wanting to ask a question about ash dieback. I realise that Forestry Commission has very good guidelines on what you can do if you have plantations or natural woodlands with ash in it, but we don't seem to have anything north and south that I'm aware of, and I think it would be very helpful if there were guidelines for landowners.
We're still trying to work out what would be the best solutions. I think if it's a relatively small number of trees, then it probably is, you might as well fell them and use them if you can. But where you get a lot of trees being affected at the same time, we're still actually working through what would be the best long-term solution approach to it. So watch this space.
A question for Laura Behan. On our family land, we've been planting some of your trees this year, and we had to use imported oak because of the lack of 2-year-old plants, because of the shortfall in seed 2 years ago. With the last 2 years, which have produced quite high quantities of acorns, will that carry us over a few years in terms of supply?
Well, as I said during the presentation, like the problem with acorns is you can't store them. So anything we collected last year or the year before had to go into the ground. So the only way we can manage that is to try and project our crops and maybe have a 2-year, a 3-year crop, depending on the demand that comes up that year. Or when we grade our trees, 50, 80s, anything that will be small, we would hold them back and plant them back into the nursery. So to answer your question, like there was a huge collection last year. You've seen on the table there, we hope to produce about 700,000 oak seedlings from that collection. So it just depends on the demand and what's out there for the next 2 or 3 years. But the max I think you could get from a collection would be 3 years. After 3 years, really anything would have to be used.
Laura, just on that point, do you keep a record? Do you match up where you're actually getting the seeds from, the acorns themselves, and then do you keep a record of where they end up?
We do, yeah.
So
there's a traceability there, because once we applied to the Forest Service for a permit to collect the seed, so that once we get a permit then, so that permit number is assigned to that batch of seed.
So you can trace it around the country?
We get a master cert for that seed. So the master cert then, you have to have the master cert when you're applying for your grant. So that stays with the trees then.
Lovely, thank you. Lady here.
And sorry, you can't store them because you have no place to store them,
no,
or because they're not viable afterwards?
Viable. We reckon they lose about 10% viability every month. They're kept in storage. So even if we collect our acorns in November, we try to sow them in November. Even if sometimes you get a very wet November, wet December, and you can't sow them until January, February time when the ground dries out, we reckon you'd lose maybe 20%, 30% of your what you'd expect to get from that batch of acorns.
And can you sell them to anybody can they be used, the ones? No, you,
They just wouldn't germinate.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
The lady
Thanks.
behind you there, if you pass the microphone, thank you.
Hi, my question is for Tim Burkett. Hi, Tim. Aileen O'Sullivan of Quilta. Just very interested to hear of all the scary challenges in terms of trying to coordinate proper deer management and deer control across the country. It's an issue that comes up for us in certification audits all the time, and I know private growers, once they start to move into certification, are going to face the same challenge, because it's an issue that really requires a cross-sectoral approach. It's bigger than Quilta, it's bigger than private forest owners. Who is going to drive the bus for us on deer management, and how do we manage to get all the right players on board?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things we've suffered from in the past is the entire process of deer management, and I use that term advisedly because we're not actually managing deer at all, is that there has been absolutely no coordination whatsoever. And the only way that we're going to make any progress is to actually coordinate our actions. And there's been a sort of reluctance, I suppose, from any government department to take responsibility and take the lead. And until we can resolve that, so until one or two government departments can actually take on the responsibility and start leading it, then we're going to be floundering around for the next God knows how many years. And it's a bit of a grim picture, but deer tend to be quite emotive. I mean, I think there's so many different aspects to it. You have recreational hunting, which are quite an effective lobby group. But the core of it really is that we simply have not got to the stage where we actually understand what deer management is. And that's a major challenge.
Just in front of you there.
Hi, how are you doing? I have a question for Lara. Just wondering, is there a restriction on the amount of seeds you're allowed to collect? Just wondering, does it upset the ecosystem in the forest you're collecting and the animals and the habitats there?
Not really. It's not really an issue because basically we collect whatever we can, but say it is fair competition and the animals do get their fair share, let me tell you. So really we just try and maximise what we can collect, and like everybody has the same chance of getting it. So it doesn't really, no, we like as I say, we don't bring big machines in, we don't bring in cherry pickers, or basically we just go in, a guy with maybe a wheelbarrow, a bag, and we roll out the nets. So we don't really disturb the ecosystem or
Is there surveying done to prove this, or is it just your opinion?
Well, my opinion, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Gentleman here, thanks. And then at the front.
Sorry, just a question for Tim. You mentioned there habitat remodelling, and just maybe if you'd briefly enlarge on that, or is that given in accommodating to the deer that we change our idea of habitat because of the pressures of deer?
No, I think what I was getting at is habitat modelling, where you're actually looking at how habitats are predicted to change over time. And I think one of the problems we suffer from is that as human beings, we have a difficulty in looking long term. We can generally kind of look ahead maybe weeks or maybe a year at the most, but when you start talking about looking ahead long term, and I'm talking about maybe 20 or 50 years or more, we have great difficulty in doing that. But I think we have to try and predict how habitats are likely to change over time and how that's going to affect deer usage of those particular habitats.
A gentleman behind you actually has got his hand up there. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Kieran Nugent from Forest Service. Just in relation to Tim and Aileen's question, Tim's answer, we've had a deer management forum in place now for 3 years. Woodlands of Ireland are a constituent member of that, and that's supported by the National Park Service and the Department of Agriculture. I suppose, as Tim has rightly said, there are a lot of different players in the space. The human landscape around deer management is almost as complicated as the animal issues itself. Getting all of those stakeholders to act in a cohesive, coherent manner is probably the most difficult part of the deer management challenge. It's the biggest challenge I think that we face in terms of native woodland. I suppose we have a lot of work to do to get that capacity on the ground to do some of the things that Tim has said, and to do some of the other things that we need to do, simply to be aware of how much deer actually cost us, not just in terms of native woodlands, but across the whole forest sector. There's a lot of costs involved now with it. So just to raise the point that the Deer Forum exists, it's going into its second stage. We're examining it now and seeing how that can be improved. And also both Teagasc and the forest sector are going to be looking at developing deer education and awareness programs for use both in the general agriculture sector to advise and inform farmers as to how deer work, what they are and how they impact on agriculture, and also the same in the forest sector. We need to educate and train ourselves to deal with this problem, and that's effectively started now.
Thank you so much. Tim, do you agree on the point of education? Or, I mean, you said something quite strong, which is a paradigm shift. We need to take a paradigm shift away from shooting being the only management tool. But your point about data collection, I mean, how far away do you think the authorities are from the kind of where they need to be when it comes to data on deer?
We really haven't started. That's basically it. We haven't got our heads around the idea of data collection in relation to deer, particularly, and we really need to get started on that, because, as I say, we have this approach which I suppose is historical, but is also oversimplifying the problem, which is basically, if there is a problem with deer, we then take out the gun and deal with them. And there is no other, at the moment, there is no other approach. And it clearly hasn't worked. We still have enormous problems. In fact, I would go as far as to say that a lot of the problems with the approach that we're currently taking, we're actually creating more problems than we're solving. So we need to understand the importance of data collection, and we need to start doing it, and start doing it now.
Okay, gentlemen at the front, we're nearly going to have coffee now in a minute. If anyone's dying for coffee, we'll kick a few more questions.
Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier there, I think it was the seed savers, about the genetically modified seed or plants. The risk, I would say, of somebody growing these and the possibility of pollen spread and therefore the impact on other native species. Is there any way of identifying if you have a genetically modified plant without knowing that somebody has already planted? In other words, if a new plant grows beside your native one, can you tell?
Well, probably not by looking at it, or at least unless you had a picture of a seed packet and then you could tell by the picture. But I don't think it's happened in Ireland yet. We're still, as far as wild flora anyway is concerned, we're still okay. But if you knew what it was that was being grown, but things like seed bombs, no data obviously comes with them, no question of origin, or so not unless you did genetic testing. No, you're not going to see it.
Thank you. Lady there and a gentleman here, and then we'll break for coffee. Thank you.
Lar, just a question on bumper crops for acorns, and throughout your experience, are you able to roughly forecast different symptoms, different seasons that are coming on, to roughly kind of judge if it'll be a bumper crop, say for any seed, acorn or otherwise? Would you have a sense of what are the telltale symptoms for you that it might be a bumper crop coming on?
There's no real telltale signs, really. There's so many variables and so many things that can happen. You could have a bumper year for flowering early in the year, and you'd say to yourself, things are looking good, but then conditions could change. You could get a dry summer, and that can stop the acorns developing. Also, the acorns can begin to develop early in the summer, and you can get a bit of a drought, and then they don't form properly. So really, until you're putting them in the bag to bring them back to the nursery, that's when you know. It's before that, it's completely unknown, really.
Thank you, and the gentleman over here. Debbie, just while we're waiting for the microphone, presumably the same is said for you in terms of your seed collection, and especially with the bad weather we've had recently.
Yeah, absolutely. There's flowers and flora have mast years as well as trees. We've discovered, we never really thought about that before, but certainly, yeah, you can't tell.
Hello, Paul Dowding, tree grower and sometime educator of quite a few people in this room. I've got some observations to make. Virtually all GMO plants are resistant to Roundup, so one way you could test is give your mystery plant a squirt of Roundup. The second observation, I like the idea of educating deer not to eat oak seedlings, but I'm half serious. I grew birch in Meath with plenty of squirrels running all over it, no problems. I grow birch down in Carlow, I lose 5,000 trees because of grey squirrels. So different families of grey squirrels have different preferences about sort of trees that they eat. I wonder whether there's anything going on like that in deer.
Yes, yeah, I think there probably is, actually, yeah.
Does the research indicate it at all? Does the research indicate there is something, as he was saying, similar in deer or not?
Yes, I think, we do know that deer, different species have obviously different diets, and we also know that they have an ability to target plants that are high in nitrogen. Don't know how they do it, but they're able to do it.
So the idea of a management plan then, it would have to be at a very local level for it to be properly effective.
Yeah.
Do we feel like a few more questions, or if anyone is desperate for caffeine, there is coffee now outside. Are there any more questions briefly before we finish? Or does coffee win? Thank you so much, and please put your hands together for the panel.